23 days. That was how long she had not sat down, not at meals, not at the gatherings, not even at night, when her legs shook so badly she gripped the edge of her bed just to stay upright. Because sitting meant agony, a tearing thing that ripped up her spine like she was being pulled apart all over again. She told them. That was the thing, she told them. It hurts when I sit. Pain builds character, love. A girl from a good family has to be strong. It feels like I'm being torn apart all over again. You're lucky it wasn't worse. Some things are better left as accidents. So she stood and waited for the wound to heal her or finish her. Then the doors of the records hall swung open and a stranger with silver eyes swept the room and stopped. On the one person an entire pack had agreed not to see. He noticed how she was standing, and everything changed.
23 days. That was how long Otaline Marsh had not sat down. Not once. Not at meals. Not at the evening gatherings. Not even late at night, when her legs shook so badly she had to grip the edge of her bed just to stay upright. She stood through all of it, jaw clenched, eyes down, because sitting meant agony, a tearing, splitting thing that ripped through her lower body like she was being pulled apart all over again, and standing only meant a duller burn, a burn that never fully left, but a burn she could survive, so she stood. The autumn air hung heavy over Moon Hollow that morning, that cool waiting stretch before the first frost, the kind of cold that creeps under doors and settles in old wounds. And Otaline had a wound that would not close. The records hall sat at the heart of the pack's main lodge, a long wooden room, shelves of ledgers from floor to ceiling, births, deaths, territory lines, trade agreements going back generations. She had worked here since she was 16, 6 years now. Long enough to know every shelf in the dark. She was good at it. Quiet work. Useful work. Work that let her be seen without being looked at too closely, which had always suited her fine. Until 3 weeks ago, she pressed her palm flat against the counter, took a breath, the way her mother had taught her to breathe through a fever when she was small. In slow. Out slower. Her knuckles had gone white again. Otaline, dear. You look positively wretched, old Maeve, who ran the pack kitchens, setting down a tray of tea with the easy carelessness of a woman who had said 100 soft things that morning and meant none of them deeply. Otaline swallowed hard. It hurts when I sit, Maeve. The words came out thin, almost a test, to see if they still meant anything. Maeve patted her hand. Pain builds character, love. A girl from a good family has to be strong. And then, just like that, she turned to the harvest, the turnips, the early frost. Whether the smokehouse had enough room, the subject. Changed, and Otaline stood there behind her counter and felt something in her chest crack a little further, not break. It had been cracking for so long, now there was hardly anything left to break. Just a slow, steady widening, a fault line. Running straight down the middle of her, she had told them. That was the thing. She had told them. She told the healer's assistant in the corridor. The woman gave a tight little smile and kept walking. She told Maeve. Twice now, she had told her own mother. Once, and her mother. Her mother's eyes had gone soft, soft with something that looked almost like grief. And then her mother had turned her face toward the window and said nothing at all. That silence had hurt worse than the wound, because a wound you can at least name. Moon Hollow had a story about what happened to Otaline Marsh, a clean one, a short one. It went like this. During a training exercise near the old grounds, she took a hard fall, an unfortunate accident. The kind of thing that happens to young wolves who train too late, when the light goes bad and the ground turns uneven. One sentence, no follow-up questions needed. It was also a lie, and Otaline knew it down to the marrow of her bones. Because she had been there. She remembered all of it, the rope biting into her ankles, the ground tearing at her skin, the roar of an engine dragging her through the dark, like she was nothing more than cargo that had fallen off a cart and no one had bothered to pick up. She remembered the laughter, high, sharp, the laughter of someone who had never once been told no and made to mean it. She remembered crawling. And she remembered the moment she stopped feeling her legs, and the long, terrible hours after, when feeling came back. As fire, as infection, as a wound nobody dared treat properly, because treating it properly would have meant admitting what it was. The pack healer had looked at her for less than 2 minutes, pressed a cool hand to her forehead, wrote something in his ledger, and told her gently that she was lucky it wasn't worse. He gave her a salve that did nothing, and a warning, soft, unmistakable, that some things were better left as accidents. She had understood him perfectly, because an accident can be forgotten. An attack cannot, not without someone being blamed, and in Moon Hollow, blame only ever rolled one direction, downhill, toward girls like her, so she swallowed the truth, because she had no choice, and she stood, because sitting hurt too much, and she waited. For the infection to either heal her, or finish her, whichever came first. A young wolf came in, Petra. Arms full of trade ledgers, they had grown up 2 doors apart, had shared secrets about boys and futures, had once spent an entire summer planning a trip to the coast neither of them ever took. Petra set the ledgers down. Didn't quite meet her eyes. You look tired, not unkind. Not a question either. I'm fine, Otaline said, because that was the answer everyone wanted, and because the other answer. I am not fine. I have not been fine for 23 days. Please, somebody, look at me. That answer had stopped working weeks ago. Petra nodded, relieved, and left. Quickly, Otaline watched her go, and turned back to the ledgers. That was when the doors at the far end of the hall opened, and the air in the room changed, not loud, no horn, no announcement. Just the heavy creak of the double doors swinging inward, and then a presence. The way a held breath fills a chest right before someone speaks, every wolf in the hall straightened. Conversations died mid-sentence. Even Maeve, passing through with her tray, stopped, so suddenly the cups rattled. Otaline looked up, out of pure instinct, and found herself looking at a stranger who was clearly not a stranger to anyone else. He was tall, taller than any wolf she had ever seen, built the way men get built by decades of discipline rather than vanity. Dark hair threaded faintly with silver at the temples, though his face didn't look old at all, and his eyes. When they swept the room, they were a pale, striking silver, the color of moonlight on water. And they moved with the slow confidence of a man who had never once needed to rush to get what he wanted. She didn't know who he was. But she knew, instantly, from the way every spine in the room had gone rigid, that he was someone whose presence mattered. He moved further in, flanked by 2 warriors in dark gray. His gaze drifted across the shelves, the high windows, the wolves at their tasks, and then his eyes reached her, and stopped. She felt it, like a physical thing, that gaze landing on her. Not the curious, fleeting glance most strangers gave. Something that lingered, something that noticed. And suddenly she was painfully aware of how she was standing. Weight shifted to one side, one hand braced on the counter, jaw tight against a wave of pain that had chosen that exact moment to roll through her lower back. She tried to straighten, to look ordinary, to look like a girl who belonged behind a records counter and nothing more. It didn't work. Her knees wavered. Just slightly, just for a heartbeat, and across the room she saw something flicker in those silver eyes. Not pity, something sharper, something that looked almost like recognition, as if he had just read a sentence written in a language everyone else in the room had forgotten how to see. Then a council elder stepped forward. Smooth, a deep bow, a stream of formal words, honored, welcome, territory, treaty, and the moment passed. But as the stranger turned to follow the elder out, his gaze cut back to her. One more time, brief as a blink. She didn't know his name yet. She would learn it soon enough. Alpha King Lucien Vosburg, ruler of the Vosburg territories. Here on Moon Hollow soil for what the council called diplomatic talks, what she didn't know. Standing there with her hand braced on the counter, and the pain singing up her spine, was that those silver eyes had just changed the entire shape of her life. Lucien Vosburg had ruled for 11 years, and in that time, he had learned to read a room the way other wolves read a map. Every pack had a rhythm. The easy laughter of wolves who felt safe, the sharp edges of old rivalries, the comfortable silence of trust. He could feel those rhythms the moment he crossed a border. The way some men feel a change in weather before the first cloud shows. Moon Hollow's rhythm was wrong, not obvious. The council was polite. Warm, even. The lodge was well kept. The warriors disciplined. The harvest stores full. On the surface, everything about this pack looked exactly the way a strong, healthy pack should look. But underneath it, there was a silence that didn't belong, a carefulness in the way people spoke, as if certain words were being stepped around. The way a wolf steps around broken glass on a path he knows by heart, he had noticed it within an hour of arriving. And here was the thing most wolves never guessed about him. He had not come to Moon Hollow by accident. There had been rumors, Whispers that traveled the old trade routes the way smoke travels under a door. A pack with something wrong in it. Wolves who went quiet. Families who left suddenly. Nothing you could name. Nothing you could prove. But Lucan had learned, through 11 years and 3 border wars and more betrayals than he cared to count, that the things you cannot prove are very often the things most worth finding. So the treaty talks were real. The hires and quotas and hunting grounds were real. And the talks were expected to run a full week, maybe more, which gave a patient man a great deal of time. And they were also a door. By the end of his first day, he had a name for the feeling, even if he didn't yet have a reason for it. The girl in the records hall. He hadn't planned to notice her. His attention had been on the elders, but some instinct. The same instinct that had kept him alive through 3 wars and a dozen attempts on his life. That instinct had pulled his eyes toward her before he understood why. And once he'd looked, he couldn't stop seeing it, the way she stood. Weight tilted carefully to one side, the faint sheen of fever at her hairline, despite the cool air. The way her smile when the other girl spoke to her never reached her eyes, built and held in place, like a mask pinned on with effort, and under all of it, an exhaustion so deep it had settled into her bones. The kind he had only ever seen in wolves who had been wounded, and left to heal alone, without care. For far too long, that night, in the guest quarters Moon Hollow had prepared for him, Luke stood at the window a long time. Something is wrong here, he thought. And everyone in this pack has agreed not to see it. He had built his rule on one principle above all others. A leader who stops looking for the truth has already started failing the people who depend on him. He decided, standing there with the cold night air drifting through the cracked window, that he would find out what was happening to that girl. He told himself it was a matter of principle. He didn't entirely believe himself. Even then, the next morning, he walked the lodge grounds before the talks resumed, a habit, he told the attendants. It helped him think. In truth, it gave him a chance to move through the pack without an entourage, to watch, to listen, without the careful performance that started up the moment the council was present. He found the records hall easily enough boozier in the morning, wolves coming and going. Ledgers pulled and refiled. He stood near the doorway a moment, unseen, and watched. She was there again, behind the same counter. But today there was a stool, tucked beneath the counter. He noticed it immediately, the way he might notice a weapon out of place. She did not sit on it. Not once in the several minutes he watched. She stood, shifting her weight, slowly, methodically, from one side to the other, the way someone shifts weight off an old wound that never healed right. An older wolf approached, gray-haired, the bearing of someone senior. He spoke to her briskly about a missing ledger, she answered politely. Retrieved it from a high shelf, bent, reached, handed it over with visible care. He left without a word of thanks. Nobody offered her the stool. Nobody asked if she wanted to sit, and Lucan felt something tighten in his chest. Not quite anger, not yet, but the early warning of it, the way a storm announces itself with a drop in pressure, long before the first raindrop falls. He stepped into the hall. He didn't go straight to her. That would have drawn attention. Instead, he moved along the shelves, idle interest, working his way slowly toward her end of the counter. Up close, the signs were even clearer. The shadows under her eyes were almost violet. Her hands, when she reached for a ledger, trembled, just slightly. Not from weakness alone, he thought. From the effort of holding herself together. "Good morning," he said, yet. But it still made her flinch, just for a heartbeat. Before she caught herself and turned with the same polished smile she'd shown everyone else. "Good morning, Alpha King." She dipped her head. "Is there something you need from the records hall?" "Actually, yes." He let his gaze drift to the shelves. "I'm told your pack keeps detailed territory maps. I'd like to see the most recent survey of the eastern boundary. If it's no trouble, it was, in fact, no trouble. And also, in fact, not something he needed. But it gave her a reason to move, and it gave him a reason to watch her do it. She walked carefully, each step measured. When she reached up for a rolled map on a high shelf, her breath caught. As the movement pulled at something low in her back, she returned, set the map on the counter, smoothed it out with hands that were, he noted, very deliberately not resting on the counter's edge for support. Even though he suspected she wanted to, here you are, the Eastern Boundary Survey. From last spring, he looked down at the map without really seeing it. Then back up at her. "You've been standing a long time this morning." Not a question. Something flickered behind her eyes. surprise. Quickly hidden. It's no trouble, Alpha King. It's my work. There's a stool right there. He nodded toward it, gentle. You could sit. A pause. Just a heartbeat too long. I prefer to stand. He could have pushed. He didn't, so he simply nodded, thanked her for the map, and walked away. But at the doors, he glanced back. Once, she had gripped the edge of the counter. The moment she thought he wasn't looking, knuckles white. Head bowed, breathing slowly through what was clearly a wave of pain. Lucien walked out of the records hall with his jaw tight and a decision already forming. Whatever happened to that girl? The official story is a lie, and I intend to find out the truth. The talks that day dragged on for hours, boundary lines, trade quotas. Lucien answered questions, made small concessions, and the whole time he watched. For the flicker, the tell, the place where the careful surface might crack. He found it in the smallest moment, a junior council member. Young, nervous, mentioned almost in passing an incident from a few weeks back. Of course, since the unfortunate accident at the old training grounds, we've increased oversight of evening sessions. The room's temperature didn't change. No one moved. But Lucien, watching closely, saw three things happen at once. The senior elder's hand tightened on the table. The pack healer, an older wolf named Edmund, went very still, and the junior council member, who had spoken, flushed red and quickly moved to the next topic. As though he'd said something he wasn't supposed to, that evening, alone in his quarters, he sent one of his warriors, a sharp, quiet wolf named Tobias, to make discreet inquiries among the lower ranks. Tobias returned within the hour. With a troubled face, "There's a girl," Tobias said. "Family name of Marsh. About 3 weeks ago she was hurt. Badly. Officially, she fell during a training exercise. Near the old grounds, he hesitated. But nobody seems to know which exercise. The old grounds haven't been used for organized training in 5 years. And the healer who treated her. People get quiet when his name comes up. Lucien had already guessed most of it. But hearing it confirmed sent a slow, cold certainty settling into his chest. "Tomorrow," he said, "I want to speak with her. Privately. Without an audience. That might draw attention," Tobias said carefully. "Then we won't call it an audience." Lucien turned from the window. "We'll call it whatever makes it easiest for her to say yes." The opportunity came the next evening. Lucien had noticed that Otaline stayed late most evenings, after the hall officially closed. So he waited until the evening meal bell rang and most of the pack had gathered in the dining hall. And then he walked back to the records hall. Alone, she was there, as he'd expected. The hall lit by a single lamp, shelving a stack of ledgers. She startled when the door opened, and her composure snapped back into place so fast it might have fooled anyone who hadn't spent 2 days watching for the cracks underneath. "Alpha King," she straightened. "I'm sorry. The hall is closed for the evening. But if you need something..." "I don't need anything from the hall." He stayed near the door, close enough to talk, far enough not to feel like a threat. "I came to talk to you, if that's all right," she blinked. "To talk to me, Alpha King? Lucien is fine. And yes, I'd like to ask you something, and I'd like you to feel free to refuse." "No one else needs to know we spoke at all." She studied him a long moment. He let her. "What is it you want to ask?" Her voice had gone very quiet. "I want to ask about your accident. The one at the old training grounds. 3 weeks ago, something shifted in her face. Not surprise. More like the specific, exhausted dread of someone who has been asked this question before. By people who didn't actually want to hear the answer. It was nothing," she said automatically. "A fall. I wasn't careful enough during..." "Otaline," he said her name gently, and watched her flinch at the sound of it. "I've spent 11 years learning to tell the difference between a wolf who fell and a wolf who was hurt. I'm not asking to embarrass you. I'm asking because I don't think anyone has actually asked you yet. Not really. Not in a way where they were prepared to believe the answer." Her hands resting on the counter had begun to tremble. "Why does it matter to you?" Her voice cracked on the last word. "You're leaving in a few days. This isn't your pack. This isn't your problem." "Maybe not," Lucien admitted. "But I saw you yesterday, standing behind that counter. And I saw what it cost you just to stay on your feet. And I haven't been able to stop thinking about it since." He took a single step closer. Slow, careful. 23 days, Otaline. That's how long you've been standing, isn't it? Because sitting hurts too much. Her breath left her in something that was almost a sob. Quickly swallowed. "How did you?" "I noticed things. And I noticed that whatever happened to you 3 weeks ago, it wasn't a training accident. For a long moment, she said nothing. She stared down at the counter, at her own trembling hands. And Lucan watched the careful mask she'd worn for 3 weeks begin, finally, to slip, if I tell you, she whispered. It won't change anything. It will just make things worse. For me, for my family, it might, he said, honestly. Truth has a way of making things worse before it makes them better. But I can promise you this. Whatever you tell me stays between us. Unless and until you decide otherwise. I won't act on it without your knowledge, and I won't pretend I didn't see what I saw. The way everyone else in this pack seems willing to do. Another long silence. He could hear her breathing. Shallow. Careful. It wasn't an accident, she whispered. Finally, the words seemed to cost her everything. Lucan stayed very still, giving them room to exist. Not rushing to fill the silence, I know, he said quietly. Thank you for telling me. She looked up at him then. Really looked. For the first time since he'd walked in, and in her eyes he saw something he recognized. Because he had felt it himself. Once, a long time ago, the exhausted, disbelieving relief of being heard. Of having someone simply believe you. Without conditions, I'm not ready to tell you everything, she said. Stay dear now, not tonight, but thank you, for asking. For believing me before I'd even said anything. Take whatever time you need, Lucan said. I'm not going anywhere. Not until I understand what happened to you. Get some rest, Otaline, he said softly, stepping back toward the door, and then his gaze dropped, briefly, to the stool tucked beneath the counter, then back to her face. Sit down, please. You don't have to keep standing. Not tonight. Not in front of me. For a long moment, she just looked at him. Then, slowly, carefully, wincing as the movement pulled at wounds that had never been properly treated. Otaline Marsh sat down, for the first time in 23 days, and let out a breath that sounded like it had been held for 3 weeks. Lucan watched her, and felt the storm that had been building in his chest since the moment he first saw her finally settle. Into something colder, sharper, and far more dangerous, to whoever had done this to her. Sleep did not come easily to Otaline that night. She lay on her side, because her back still couldn't bear the weight of lying flat, and stared at the ceiling, replaying the conversation again and again. Every time she reached the moment he'd said, I notice things, something in her chest did a strange, unfamiliar thing, a loosening. Like a knot pulled so tight for so long, it had forgotten how to be anything but tight. For 3 weeks, she had been quietly convincing herself that she had imagined the worst of it. That maybe the healer was right, that maybe she was being dramatic, the way the older women implied. Every time she mentioned the pain. But Lucan hadn't needed convincing. He had looked at her, actually looked, and known instantly that something was deeply wrong, and then he had asked, directly, gently, in a way that left room for her to say no, and she had said yes. She had told the truth. It wasn't an accident, 4 words, and yet they felt like the heaviest thing she had ever lifted, for the first time in 3 weeks. Otaline Marsh fell asleep, without rehearsing the lie she would tell, if anyone asked. The next afternoon, Lucan came back, another map, another excuse. But this time he brought someone with him, a quiet gray-haired wolf, introduced simply as a healer traveling with his retinue. Her name was Brisa. What Lucan didn't say, in front of the handful of pack members moving through the hall, was that Brisa was not simply a healer. She was his healer, one of the most skilled in his territories, a wolf whose discretion he trusted as completely as her judgment. When the hall finally cleared for the midday meal, Lucan drew the doors closed and turned to Otaline, who had gone very still at the sight of the second visitor. This is Brisa, he said gently. I trust her completely, with skill and with secrets. I'd like her to look at your injuries, properly, not to report anything to anyone, just so we know what we're dealing with. Edmund already examined me, Otaline said carefully. The pack healer, I know what he said. I'd like a second opinion. That's all this is. And you're allowed to refuse. Brisa stepped forward then, and her voice when she spoke was warm. I won't hurt you, dear. I promise. And whatever I find stays with the 3 of us. You have my word. Otaline looked at Lucan. Really looked, as if searching his face for some sign that this was a trick. She didn't find one, finally. She nodded. They moved to a small storage room off the records hall. Private, a single high window letting in soft afternoon light. Brisa worked carefully, gently, asking quiet questions as she went. And Otaline answered them in a voice that grew steadier the longer the examination went on. As if simply being treated with care was, in itself, a kind of medicine, Lucan stood near the door, giving them space. but close enough to hear. He watched Brisa's expression shift, from professional calm to something tighter. As she examined the wounds around Otaline's ankles, wounds that should have healed cleanly in 3 weeks, and instead had gone wrong, infected. The skin around them raw and angry. These wounds were not caused by a fall, Brisa said quietly. After several long minutes, she wasn't asking. She was confirming something she already knew. No, Otaline admitted. Just as quietly, something was tied around your ankles, tightly, and then you were dragged across rough ground. For some distance, Brisa looked up, met her eyes. What was done to you was not an accident, and it was not minor. This was an assault, a serious one. And whoever treated you afterward either didn't look closely enough to see that, or chose not to see it, Lucan finished, quietly. From the doorway, Brisa nodded, grim. The salve that was used here actually slowed the healing, she frowned, leaned closer, and then went very still. Debris, she repeated. Almost to herself, she reached into her bag. Fine forceps, a magnifying lens, and worked carefully at the edge of one wound. When she straightened, she was holding something between the forceps, small, dark, fibrous, a fragment of rope, embedded so deeply in the old wound that scar tissue had begun to seal it inside. This has been in there for weeks, Brisa said, untreated. No wonder the infection hasn't cleared. Lucan crossed the room and looked at the fragment closely. A particular weave, tight, dark, treated with something that gave it a faint sheen. This isn't ordinary rope, he said slowly. This is treated cord, the kind used for securing equipment to transports, patrol gear. Whoever did this didn't improvise with whatever was lying around. This came from somewhere specific. Otaline's face had gone pale. But she didn't look away. It was falcry gear, she said, quietly. I've seen it before. The kind only the Alpha's family and their personal guard use. Most wolves in this pack train with plain rope, she gestured weakly. This belonged to Dorian Falkry. The name landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water. Lucan had heard it, in passing. During the talks, Dorian Falkry, son of Alpha Garrick Falkry, the ruling Alpha of Moon Hollow. He had seemed, in the brief introductions, like an unremarkable young wolf, handsome, arrogant in the careless way of someone who had never once been told no. Now the name meant something else entirely. Dorian did this to you, Lucan said. Not really a question, but he asked it anyway, because he wanted to hear her say it. After 3 weeks of having it taken from her, her hands were shaking again, but her voice when it came was steady. Yes, a breath. Dorian Falkry tied that rope around my ankles and dragged me behind his patrol transport, because I told him no. And he didn't like it. Her jaw tightened, and his father made sure the truth would never be the official story. Because the official story can't ever be that the Alpha's son did something like this. To a clerk's daughter, Brisa cleaned the wound, properly. Dressed it the way it should have been dressed 3 weeks ago, even as the words she'd just spoken hung heavy in the air. And Lucan stood very still, feeling the cold, focused anger that had been building since he first saw her settle into something far more dangerous. A calm, deliberate fury. The kind he had learned, over years of leadership, to trust completely, because it never made him reckless. It made him precise. Tell me everything, he said quietly, once Otaline was settled on a low bench against the wall, from the beginning. Take whatever time you need. And so she told him, and in the telling the months unfolded. It had started innocuously enough. Months ago, with Dorian's attention, how he had begun seeking her out, complimenting her, finding excuses to be wherever she was. At first she had thought little of it, because plenty of young wolves flirted without meaning anything by it, but it had gotten worse. His attention had stopped feeling like flattery, and started feeling like something else. Possessive, entitled, the kind of interest that didn't seem to require her actual consent to exist. He had begun cornering her, in hallways, finding reasons to touch her arm, her hair, in ways that made her skin crawl. I tried to be polite at first, she said. I told myself I was imagining it, that he didn't mean anything, that a clerk's daughter doesn't say no to the Alpha's son without a very good reason. A pause. But the reasons kept getting better, and the politeness stopped working, so she had finally told him no, firmly, in front of several of his friends, during a pack gathering, because she'd hoped an audience might make him back off. More gracefully than a private word would, it had the opposite effect. He was humiliated, she said. Her voice flat now, the way voices go when someone describes something they've relived too many times in their own mind, in front of his friends. He didn't say anything at the time, just smiled, the way he always smiled, and walked away, a pause. But I knew it wasn't over. She had spent the next 3 days waiting, watching the doorways, taking the long routes home, telling herself she was being foolish, that nothing would come of it, that a smile was just a smile. On the third day, she let herself believe it, took the shortcut by the old training grounds, the one she'd taken 100 times when Dorian appeared. Alone, blocking the path. He was different, she said. Not angry, exactly. Calm. That was the worst part. He was calm and smiling, and he told me I'd embarrassed him, and that I needed to learn some manners. Her hands tightened in her lap. Then he grabbed me. I tried to run. But he's stronger than me. And she stopped, breathed, continued. He tied the rope around my ankles. I thought he was trying to scare me. I thought he'd let me go. After I apologized. After I cried. He didn't, Lucan said, quietly. Not a question. He got on his transport, she said, and started driving. Slow at first. Just enough to drag me a few feet. I think hearing me beg was the point. Her voice had gone very quiet, very flat, but then he stopped being slow. He sped up, and after that, I don't remember most of it, just the ground and his laughter. Getting fainter as he drove. How did you get back? Breeza asked. Gently, I crawled. 2 words, simple as that. He stopped. Eventually, maybe he got bored, maybe he realized he'd gone too far. He cut the rope, said something I don't remember, and left. A long breath. I crawled back toward the lodge. It took most of the night. I remember stopping, more than once, thinking I would just rest, just for a moment, and knowing that if I stopped resting, I might not start again. So I kept moving. Because there was nothing else to do, Lucan's hands had curled into fists at some point during the story. He made a deliberate effort to relax them. Because Otaline didn't need to see his anger right now. She needed to see that someone had heard her, completely, without flinching away from any part of it. And when you got back, he said, "What happened?" Edmund examined me. He knew. I could see it in his face. He knew exactly what kind of wound this was. Her voice didn't waver. But he wrote training accident in his ledger, gave me a salve, and told me very gently that some things were better left as accidents. A pause. Alpha Garrick's son doesn't get blamed for things. Not in this pack. Not ever. And your family? My mother knew something was wrong, and for the first time her composure wavered. Not from the memory of the attack, but from this I could see it in her face. Every time I told her it hurt. But she has a position in this pack, a family to protect. And she made a choice. Her voice cracked. She chose the pack story. Everyone did. Everyone except me, Lucan said quietly, and now Breeza. And from this moment forward, Otaline, that number is only going to grow. What he did not say, not yet, was that the story she'd just told had a hole in it, a hole he kept turning over that night. Alone because Dorian Falkry was cruel, that much was clear. A wolf who had never been told no, lashing out the first time he heard the word. But cruelty alone didn't explain the cover-up. A cruel young man drags a girl behind a transport in a fit of rage. Fine, ugly, but possible. What it didn't explain was an entire council going silent. A healer falsifying a report. A senior elder's hand tightening on a table at the mere mention of a place. That kind of silence costs something, and packs only pay that kind of price to protect something larger than one young man's temper. So Lucan sent Tobias out again, wider this time, quieter. And what Tobias found over the next 3 days painted a picture far larger and far darker than even Lucan had expected. Otaline was not the first. There was an older warrior, a wolf named Cormac, who had quietly left active patrol duty 2 years ago, after what was officially recorded as a training injury, one that left him with a permanent limp. His injury, it turned out, had occurred during a dispute with Dorian Falkry. A dispute over a patrol assignment Cormac had refused to falsify. There was a young healer's assistant, a woman named Betrayal, quietly transferred to a remote outpost 18 months ago. After raising concerns about injuries she'd treated that didn't match their official explanations. She'd been gone before anyone could ask too many questions about why. There was an entire family, the Ashgroves, who had left Moon Hollow 3 years ago, officially to pursue better hunting grounds up north, but who had, according to 2 older pack members, left rather suddenly. Not long after their eldest daughter had a brief, unhappy entanglement with Dorian. None of these stories, on their own, proved anything. Each had an official explanation. But together, laid side by side, they formed a pattern so clear that Lucan felt something cold settle into his stomach as Tobias finished. "This isn't one bad incident," Lucan said. standing at his window as the sun set over the ridge. This is a pattern, years of it. And every single time, the pack found a way to make the truth disappear. Garrick protects his son, Tobias said. And everyone who could expose that protection gets quietly moved, or silenced, or he hesitated, or hurt badly enough that they stop being a threat. Otaline isn't an exception, Lucan finished, grimly. She's just the most recent name. On a very long list, but there was still that hole. The patrol assignment, Cormac refused to falsify. These weren't just covers for Dorian's temper. They were covers for something. Some piece of business the Falkry family needed, kept off the record, and then it occurred to him. Where every official record in Moon Hollow was kept, the records hall, and who sat on top of it, every single day. The next morning he went to her early. Before the hall opened, before the traffic, she was already there, and she was sitting. On the stool, he noticed it immediately, and something in his chest eased. Just slightly. You're sitting, he said. A small thing to say. But he meant it as more than that, and she understood it still hurts, she admitted, but less. Teresa's medicine. A pause, a faint, surprised smile. It's the first thing in 3 weeks that's actually helped. Good. He let himself look at her a moment longer than he needed to. Then made himself focus. Otaline, I need to ask you something. About your work, the records you keep. Has anything ever been unusual? Numbers that changed, pages that went missing. Anything the Falkry family took an interest in? She went still. Not the careful stillness of fear this time. Something else. The stillness of a wolf turning a key in a lock she hadn't known was there. There was a ledger, she said slowly. The Eastern Boundary records, the ones you asked to see your first day. The older survey, the one from 6 years ago. Some of the pages had been recopied. In a different hand, the boundary lines were redrawn. I assumed it was just a correction. Clerks make corrections all the time. Where do the lines go? Lucan asked. Quietly. The original survey, she said, her voice dropping. It put a stretch of the northern hunting grounds inside the Ashgrove family's holdings. The recopied version moved the line. Put that land under Falkry control, a long pause. The Ashgroves left 3 years ago. I always thought it was about their daughter. It was about both, Lucan said, slowly, the whole shape of it turning over in his mind. The daughter gave Garrick a reason to push them out. And once they were gone, no one was left to dispute the boundary. The records you keep, Otaline, are the only proof those lines were ever moved. She stared at him, and the color drained from her face. Not with fear. With understanding, that's why, she whispered. I always thought Dorian came after me because I told him no, and maybe that's part of it. But I'm the one who pulls those ledgers. I'm the one who'd notice if anyone asked the wrong questions. Her hands had gone cold. I wasn't just a girl who embarrassed him. I'm the girl who sits on top of the one record his family can't afford anyone reading too closely. Which makes you, Lucan said grimly, the most dangerous wolf in this pack. And you didn't even know it. That same evening, Otaline did something she had not expected to do. She went to see her mother. The house she had grown up in sat at the quiet end of the clerk's row. Small, neat, a single lamp burning in the window the way it always had. The sight of it caught something in her chest, because she had spent so many years walking toward that lamp, feeling safe, and so few lately, feeling anything but alone inside those walls. She went there angry. 3 weeks of silence. 3 weeks of a face turned toward a window. She had gone there ready to demand to know how a mother could look at her own daughter in that much pain and say nothing at all. But her mother had been waiting for her. That was the first surprise. Her mother was sitting at the small table by the hearth, hands folded, as if she had known somehow that tonight would be the night her daughter finally came. There was a cup of tea poured already, across the table, cold by the look of it, poured a long time ago, and waited over. Sit down, Otaline, her mother said softly. Please, I know it hurts. I know it's hurt for weeks. Sit down anyway, just this once. For me, and because the chair was already pulled out, and because something in her mother's voice had cracked clean through her anger. Otaline sat. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The fire ticked, the lamp guttered. And her mother looked at her with eyes that had aged 10 years in 3 weeks. I knew, her mother said, finally, before Otaline could speak. The moment you came home that night, I knew exactly what it was, and exactly who did it. Her hands were trembling. And I want you to understand, it was not because I didn't believe you. It was because I believed you completely, and I was terrified. You said nothing, Otaline said, her voice raw. I told you it hurt. And you turned toward the window, because the last family who spoke up about the Falkries lost their land and their home, and had to start over 100 miles north. Her mother's voice broke. You don't remember them. You were small, but I do. I remember the night they left, the wagon in the dark, the mother holding a child your age. And I remember thinking, that could be us. That could so easily be us. She rose then, crossed to the corner of the room, and knelt by the hearthstone, worked her fingers under the edge of a floorboard that Otaline had walked across her entire life and never once thought to question, and lifted it free. Underneath was a small wooden box, the kind of hiding place that takes years of fear to think of. Her mother set the box on the table between them. With the care of someone handling a thing that had cost her everything to keep. I have been a coward, her mother said. I will not pretend otherwise. When you needed me to stand up, I sat down. When you needed me to speak, I went silent, and there is no undoing that, no matter how much I wish I could, a breath that shook. But there's one thing I did, in the dark, where no one could see, where it was safe enough that even a coward could manage it. Open it, she said. Please. Otaline opened the box. Inside were papers, years of them, folded, small, some yellowed at the edges, some newer. She lifted them out one by one, with hands that had begun, somewhere along the way, to shake a note from Cormac's wife, asking quietly after his, fall, the handwriting careful, the words careful. The kind of letter a woman writes when she knows it might be read by the wrong eyes. A copy of a transfer order, with Brielle's name on it, the official stamp, the remote outpost, the date, 18 months ago, a torn page from an old ledger, the original Eastern Boundary Survey, the one before the lines were moved. In a hand Otaline recognized after a moment as her own mother's, copied out, quietly, years ago, before anyone thought to destroy the original, and more. Small things, a list of dates, a name she didn't recognize with a question mark beside it, the slow, patient archaeology of a woman who could not act but could not look away either. I couldn't speak, her mother whispered. Every time I tried, I thought of that wagon in the dark. And the words just stopped. In my throat, she pressed her hand flat against the box, but I could keep. Speaking, anyone could see. Keeping, I could do in the dark. So I kept. Everything I could reach, every scrap that crossed my desk that shouldn't have been let go. I told myself someday someone would come who could do something with it. Someone strong enough. Someone the Falkries couldn't simply make disappear. She looked up, eyes wet, and for the first time in 3 weeks, she looked her daughter full in the face. And then someone did, Otaline. He came for you, and I have been sitting here every night since, trying to find the courage to give you this. Because I was afraid, not of the Falkries. Not anymore. Her voice broke completely. I was afraid of you, of what you'd think of me, of seeing in your face that you finally understood exactly how much I had failed you. Otaline held the box against her chest, and for the first time in 3 weeks, she understood that the silence she had blamed her mother for had never been emptiness. It had been a held breath, years long. Just like her own. You didn't fail me tonight, Otaline said, quietly, and reached across the table, and, for the first time in longer than she could remember, took her mother's trembling hand. Tonight, you're the only one who came prepared. Over the following days, something else was happening. Something quieter, slower, and in many ways more important than evidence or testimony. Otaline was healing. It wasn't immediate. The infection that had taken hold over 3 untreated weeks didn't vanish overnight. But within 2 days of Brisa's care, the fever broke. Within 4, she could sit, really sit, without the careful, controlled winces that had become so familiar, she'd almost forgotten what sitting without pain felt like. And Lucan kept finding reasons to come back. A question about a map, a follow-up on a treaty detail, anything that gave him an excuse to see her, to ask, quietly, how she was healing. He told himself it was due diligence. Checking on a witness, he stopped believing that excuse by the 3rd day, when he found himself mid-afternoon with no diplomatic reason to be anywhere near the records hall, walking there anyway, because he wanted to see her smile. The real one. The one that had started appearing more and more often. As the pain receded, they talked in those days about more than the case. He found himself lingering at the counter long after the maps had been put away. She had a dry, quiet wit that took him by surprise the first time it slipped out. A way of summing up a pompous council elder in a single observation that made him laugh out loud in the empty hall, and she in turn found that he listened, actually listened. asked about the books on her shelf, the ones she read on slow afternoons, disagreed with her about half of them, cheerfully, and meant it. "You argue like someone who's used to winning," she told him once. "And you argue like someone who's used to not being heard," he answered. "Which makes you far more dangerous. You've been saving it up?" She'd laughed at that. And then gone quiet. Because it was true, and because no one had ever noticed before. On the fourth day, he suggested, carefully, the way he'd learned worked best with her, that she might benefit from some fresh air. The gardens, he mentioned, were apparently well kept, and he hadn't yet had a chance to see them properly. It wasn't subtle. He knew it wasn't subtle, but Otaline, for the first time since he'd met her, looked almost shy and said yes. The gardens were beautiful. Terraced beds of late-season flowers, winding gravel paths, a small pond where late dragonflies skimmed the surface in the slanting afternoon light. She walked slowly, still favoring her healing leg, but without the rigid, careful control that had defined every movement he'd seen from her before. "It's strange," she said, after they'd walked a while in comfortable silence. "I've lived here my whole life, and I don't think I've properly looked at these gardens in years. I used to come here as a pup, with my mother." A pause. Her expression shifted toward something more guarded. "Before things got complicated, you see more than people realize," Lucan said, watching her, working in that hall. "You've watched this pack for years, the patterns. Who gets favored? Who gets overlooked? It's easy to see patterns when nobody thinks you're paying attention," she said. No bitterness in it, just simple fact. People say things in front of records clerks they'd never say in front of council members. "We're furniture." "Mostly, you're not furniture," Lucan said, more sharply than he'd intended. And she looked at him. "Surprised I didn't mean." "I know what you meant," he gentled his tone. "I just don't agree with it, not even a little. You are one of the most observant, most resilient people I have met in a very long time. And this pack has spent years failing to see that, because seeing it would have meant admitting what they were willing to overlook." Her breath caught. Not from pain this time, from something else entirely. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The late light caught the gold in her hair, and Lucan found himself thinking, with a clarity that startled him, that he wanted very much to close the small distance between them. He didn't. "Not yet, Lucan," she said softly. And there was a question in it, asking perhaps whether what she was feeling was real, or whether she was imagining it. "I know," he said quietly, answering the question she hadn't quite asked. "I feel it too." That evening, walking back from the gardens, they passed near the lower training yards, and Otaline went suddenly completely still. Lucan followed her gaze, Dorian Falkry, across the yard. Deep in conversation with two warriors Lucan didn't recognize. "Wolves who weren't wearing Moon Hollow colors, do you know them?" Lucan asked quietly. She shook her head, slowly. "No. I've never seen them before," her brow furrowed. But Dorian's posture was tense, his voice, even from this distance, sharp with something that looked like agitation. "Something's wrong," she said. "He looks," she searched for the word, "worried." Lucan watched a moment longer, filing away the faces of the two strangers, the urgency. The way Dorian kept glancing around, as though checking whether anyone was watching, he thought about Tobias's investigation. How careful it had been, how quiet, and he wondered, with a slow chill, whether it had been quiet enough. "Otaline," he said carefully, "I think it might be wise for you to stay closer to the lodge. The next few days." Just as a precaution, she looked at him, and he saw understanding dawn. The same understanding settling into his own chest. "You think he knows?" she said quietly. "That you're investigating, I think," Lucan said, watching Dorian's tense, urgent conversation across the yard, that it might be time to find out exactly who those two wolves are, and what Dorian Falkry is suddenly so worried about. Tobias confirmed it within a day. The two strangers were rogue wolves, mercenaries, the kind who took work from anyone willing to pay. No pack loyalty, no questions asked. They'd arrived in Moon Hollow 3 days earlier, under cover of a supposed trade delegation, and had spent most of that time meeting privately with Dorian Falkry. "They're not negotiating trade," Tobias said grimly. When he reported back that evening, "I got close enough to overhear part of one conversation. They were discussing payment and a name." Lucan felt his stomach tighten. "Whose name?" "Hers," Tobias said. "Otaline's." The room went very quiet. "He knows," Lucan said slowly. "Dorian knows we're investigating. Or at least he knows enough to be afraid of what she might say. if she's ever asked formally, before the council, or worse, before the Grand Alpha Council, and his solution, Tobias said. His solution, Lucan's voice hardened, is to make sure she's never in a position to say anything at all. That's enough for me. Otaline isn't safe here, not anymore. Not with Dorian feeling cornered, and 2 rogue wolves on his payroll. He found her in the records hall, finishing the day's work, and the moment she saw his face, she knew something had changed. What happened? She asked. Setting down the ledger she'd been holding, I need you to trust me, Lucan said, and I need you to come with me tonight. To Vosburg territory, she stared at him. Lucan, I can't just leave. My family is here. My work, I know, he crossed the room, stood closer than he'd allowed himself before, and I wouldn't ask if I didn't believe it was necessary. Dorian knows we're investigating. He's hired outside wolves. And Tobias overheard them discussing payment. In connection with your name, he watched the color drain from her face, watched her square her shoulders. That same quiet courage he'd seen from the very beginning. He wants to make sure I can't testify, she said. Not a question, I think so. Yes, he reached out, carefully, and took her hand, the first time he'd touched her deliberately, and he felt her breath catch at the contact. Vosburg territory is safe, my people are loyal, my walls are strong, and nobody, not Dorian, not his father, not anyone, can reach you there without going through me first. She looked down at their joined hands, then back up at him, and he saw something settle in her expression. Not fear, trust, hard-won. Careful, all right, she said quietly. I'll come with you, and the small wooden box, the one her mother had kept under the floorboards for years, went with her, tucked deep in her belongings. Because it didn't just prove what Dorian had done. It proved what his father had built. They left that night, quietly, under cover of a supposed early departure, diplomatic reasons. Nothing unusual for an Alpha King's schedule to shift. By the time anyone in Moon Hollow noticed Otaline was gone, she was already most of the way to Vosburg territory. Riding alongside Lucan's small retinue through the cool night air, Vosburg, when they arrived, took her breath away. Not in the way she expected. It wasn't grander than Moon Hollow, exactly. Though the lodge was larger, the grounds more open. What struck her was the feeling of the place. Wolves moved through the grounds with an ease she hadn't realized was missing from home, until she felt its absence here. People laughed without glancing over their shoulders first. Even the youngest pups ran freely, nobody watching them with that particular weariness she'd known her whole life. This is what a pack is supposed to feel like, she said quietly. I didn't realize how much I'd forgotten. Until just now, this is what I've spent 11 years trying to build, Lucan said, and there was quiet pride in his voice. Not arrogance. A pack where people don't have to be afraid of the wolves who are supposed to protect them. She looked at him a long moment. Moon Hollow used to feel like that, she said softly. Before Garrick. Before Dorian got old enough to start being who he is. I remember it being different, when I was very small. I don't think I'm imagining that. You're not, Lucan said, and it can be that again, Otaline. That's what we're fighting for. Over the next days she healed, fully this time, until the pain that had defined her life for so long faded, into nothing more than a faint, occasional ache. She explored the grounds, found a library that rivaled Moon Hollow's records hall, but felt warmer, and on the 3rd evening she gave Lucan the box. Told him everything, the floorboard, the years of quiet collecting. He went through it all, slowly, by lamplight, and the longer he looked, the more still he became. Otaline, he said finally, do you understand what your mother built? This is a record of every silence the Falkry family ever bought, every name they erased. She spent years documenting a crime no one would let her speak. Powerless to use it. Until she told me she couldn't speak, she whispered. But she could keep. So she kept. Then we will speak for her, Lucan said. All of it, in a place where it can never be buried again. One evening, on a ridge that overlooked the valley, Lucan stopped, and Otaline stopped beside him. For a long moment, neither of them said anything at all. The sun was setting behind the hills, painting the sky in deep gold and rose. The air smelled of late summer, warm earth, and something green. And that particular stillness that comes right before evening settles fully in. Can I tell you something? Lucan said quietly. She turned, and found him watching her with an expression she hadn't seen before, guarded, in a way that made something in her chest tighten. Of course. When I first saw you, he said, choosing each word with obvious care, in that records hall, I told myself it was about justice. a wrong that needed righting, and it was. It still is. But somewhere between then and now, it became about something else too, something I haven't let myself feel in a very long time, because I told myself years ago that a wolf in my position couldn't afford to want things. Just because he wanted them. Her heart was beating very fast, and now? She asked, barely above a whisper. Now, Lucan said, and he reached up, slowly, and brushed a strand of hair back from her face, the first time he'd touched her like this. Gentle, deliberate. I find that I don't particularly care what I told myself years ago, because what I want, Otaline, is you, not because of what happened to you, or what you survived, just you, your laugh. The way you see things other people miss. Her breath had gone shallow, Lucan, she breathed, and the name felt different now. Not careful, not testing. Certain, you don't have to say anything, he said softly, his thumb brushing along her jaw. I just wanted you to know, whatever happens next, with the council, with justice. I wanted you to know how I feel, without any of that hanging over it. I feel it too, she said softly, the same words she'd spoken in the gardens, but this time there was nothing held back in them. I have for days. I think I was afraid to say it. Afraid that if I let myself want something this much, after everything, it would be taken away too. It won't be, Lucan said, his voice low. Rough, I promise you that, whatever else happens, that won't be taken from you. Not while I have any say in it, he leaned down, slowly, giving her every chance to step back. She didn't. The kiss, when it came, was soft, careful, questioning. But when her hands came up to rest against his chest, when she leaned into him rather than away, something in him seemed to release, and the kiss deepened into something that had clearly been building for days, and had finally found permission to exist. When they broke apart, both of them breathing unsteadily, Lucan rested his forehead against hers, and she could feel him smiling. It was, Otaline thought, the first truly perfect moment she could remember. In years, it didn't last. The attack came 2 nights later. She had gone to bed early, tired from a long day with Brisa, reviewing the final medical reports, the documentation that would form part of the evidence Lucan planned to present. She'd fallen asleep easily. In the soft bed, the windows cracked to let in the cool night air, she woke to a hand over her mouth and a voice, low, unfamiliar, telling her not to make a sound. For one long, frozen moment, the world narrowed to almost nothing. There were 2 of them. Both wolves she didn't recognize, both moving with the quiet efficiency of people who had done this kind of thing before. One held her down, the other moved toward the foot of the bed and reached for something coiled at his belt, rope. She saw it, and the sight of it did something terrible to her, because for a heartbeat she was back there, on the ground, in the dark, the engine roaring, the laughter fading, and some old exhausted part of her began to simply accept it, to go limp, to think, in a voice that sounded almost relieved, not again, I can't survive this again. So I won't fight, I'll just let it happen. The way I let everything happen. The hand over her mouth was heavy, the room was dark, and no one was coming, no one ever came. And then, underneath that, something else. Something that had been buried for 23 days of standing. For 23 days of telling people it hurt and watching them look away. Something that had been growing, quietly, every single day since a stranger with silver eyes had walked into a records hall and actually, finally, looked at her. She was not furniture, she was not a story to be managed. And she was not going to lie still in the dark one more time and let someone decide her life didn't matter. No, the word rose up in her like a tide. She bit down, hard, on the hand over her mouth, hard enough to draw blood, hard enough that the wolf holding her yelped and pulled back. Just for a heartbeat, it was enough. She twisted free, scrambled off the bed, half fell to the floor, found her feet, and screamed, a full-throated pack-summoning scream. The kind she'd never once in her life had reason to use. The kind that carries through walls, through floors, through the careful silence she'd been buried in for 3 weeks. It worked. The door burst open within seconds, and Lucan was there. Faster than she'd thought possible. Still in the loose clothes he must have been sleeping in. His eyes blazing with a fury that made the 2 rogue wolves freeze in place. What followed was brief, and violent, and entirely one-sided. His warriors, alerted by the scream, flooded into the room within moments, and the 2 rogues, who had clearly prepared for a quiet abduction and nothing more, found themselves overwhelmed and restrained. Before either could so much as draw a weapon, Otaline, shaking, found herself pulled into Lucan's arms, and felt for the first time since it began like she could breathe again. "I'm here," he said, his voice fierce and low. "I'm here. You're safe. I've got you." "They had rope," she whispered, her voice breaking. "They were going to—" "I know," he said, and she could feel the barely contained fury in his body. "I know. But they didn't. You fought back. You screamed. Do you understand what that means, Otaline? 3 weeks ago, you couldn't get a single soul to hear you, and tonight you made an entire lodge come running. You saved yourself." I just opened the door. He held her until the shaking stopped, and even then, he didn't let go. Not until she'd fallen asleep against his chest, and he carried her gently to a different room, one with guards at every entrance. The interrogation happened the next morning, and it confirmed everything Lucan had suspected. And then went further. The 2 rogues had been hired, paid in advance, to abduct Otaline Marsh and ensure she never reached the Grand Alpha Council. The instructions, they admitted, under careful but firm questioning, had come directly from Dorian Falkry. And there was more. It wasn't just Dorian, one of them said, clearly calculating that cooperation was his best chance at leniency. The arrangement, the payment, the cover. Dorian set it up, but his father knew. Alpha Garrick approved it. We were told specifically, if anything went wrong, we'd have protection from Moonhollow's council. That Garrick would make sure no one asked too many questions. Lucan felt something settle into place. Cold. Final. Certain. This was no longer just about Dorian's cruelty toward one girl. This was about an alpha. The ruling alpha of an entire pack, knowingly approving the attempted abduction of an innocent wolf, under another alpha's protection. To protect his son, this was about corruption that went all the way to the top. "Tobias," Lucan said, his voice quiet, but absolutely certain. "Send word to the Grand Alpha Council. Tell them I'm requesting an emergency hearing. And tell them why." A pause. It's time Moonhollow answered for what it's been hiding. The Grand Alpha Council convened 7 days later in the Great Hall of the Council territory. A vast stone chamber built centuries ago, where alpha of every major pack across the region could be seated, with room left over for witnesses, for the careful machinery of justice that binds packs together. When ordinary diplomacy fails, Otaline had never seen anything like it. She stood near the front, beside Lucan. Alpha Garrick Falkry sat across the chamber, flanked by Dorian, and for the first time since Otaline had known of him, Garrick looked uncertain. His easy charm strained at the edges, like a mask worn too long, finally beginning to crack. Dorian beside him looked worse, pale, tense, his eyes darting toward the exits. Lucan rose, and the chamber fell silent. "Honored Alphas," he began, his voice carrying easily through the vast chamber. "I requested this emergency session because during a diplomatic visit to Moonhollow, I discovered evidence of a serious crime, one that has been deliberately, systematically covered up by Moonhollow's leadership." For years, Brisa stepped forward, presenting the medical evidence, the documented wounds. "The rope fragment? This," Lucan said, holding up the small fragment of treated cord, was removed from the ankle of Otaline Marsh, 3 weeks after she was assaulted, dragged behind a patrol transport by Dorian Falkry. The pack healer Edmund Crail examined these wounds and falsified his report, recording them as a training accident. Despite the fact that the location cited has not been used for organized training in over 5 years, a murmur ran through the chamber. Garrick rose, his face flushed. "This is an outrageous accusation. My son would never," Garrick, and something in Lucan's tone, quiet, utterly unhurried, cut through the protest. "I have not yet finished, and I would ask that you wait until you've heard everything, before you decide what you're willing to defend," he continued, methodically, devastatingly. Testimony from Cormac, from Brielle, who had traveled at significant personal risk to be present, from 2 members of the Ashgrove family. And then Lucan reached into the small wooden box, and these are records, kept secretly. For years, by a woman who could not speak, but refused to forget, he laid them out. The original Eastern Boundary Survey, the recopied version with the lines moved. Dorian Falkry did not attack Otaline Marsh only because she refused him. He attacked her because she sits, every day, on top of the one record that proves how this family built its power. Land moved off the books. Families pushed out so the lines could never be disputed. His voice was iron now. This was never one young man's temper. This was a system. And finally, the confession of the 2 rogue wolves, confirming that Alpha Garrick himself had approved their attack. By the time Lucan finished, the chamber was utterly silent. "Otaline Marsh," Lucan said. turning toward her. Would you be willing to tell the council? In your own words. What happened to you? She felt every eye in the chamber turn toward her. Dozens of alphas, council members, wolves whose decisions shaped the lives of entire territories, all waiting to hear from a records clerk, who, 3 weeks ago, hadn't been able to get a single person in her own pack to listen. She thought for a moment about all the times she'd whispered, "It hurts when I sit," and been met with silence. About Petra looking away, about her mother turning toward the window, about Edmund writing training accident in his ledger with the calm efficiency of a man erasing a person's reality. And then she thought about Lucan. In the records hall, weeks ago, the first person to look at her and actually see what was there. She stepped forward. "My name is Otaline Marsh," she said, and her voice, to her own surprise, came out steady. Steadier than she'd ever managed telling this story before. 3 weeks ago, Dorian Falkry cornered me near the old training grounds, tied a rope around my ankles, and dragged me behind his patrol transport. Because I had refused him and embarrassed him in front of his friends, she told the chamber everything. The attack, the crawl home, the deliberate falsification, the 3 weeks of standing, because sitting was unbearable, the 3 weeks of telling anyone who would listen, and being met every single time with silence. "I want to be clear," she said, her gaze sweeping the chamber. "I'm not standing here because I want revenge. I'm standing here because for 3 weeks, an entire pack decided that the truth was less important than protecting one wolf's reputation. And because I have since learned that I wasn't the first person that happened to, and unless something changes today, I won't be the last." She looked briefly at Cormac, at Betrayal, at the Ashgroves, at the others who had finally found the courage to speak. Because she had spoken first, every one of these people deserved to be believed the first time they spoke. They weren't. "I'm asking this council to make sure that changes, not just for me, but for everyone who has ever been told, in ways large and small, that their pain doesn't matter. If the wolf who caused it has the right family name." When she finished, the chamber was silent a long moment. And then, slowly, one of the senior alphas, an older wolf from a southern territory, began to clap. Quietly at first, and then others joined, until the sound filled the great hall. Not raucous, not celebratory, something steadier, more meaningful. Recognition, respect. She felt Lucan's hand find hers, and she held on. And for the first time in 3 weeks. In longer than 3 weeks, really, if she was honest. She didn't feel alone at all. Garrick's defense was weak. The defense of a wolf who had spent so long never needing to defend anything that he'd never developed the skill for it. He tried to call the evidence exaggerated, the testimony coordinated slander. It didn't work. The medical evidence was too clear, the pattern too consistent, the confession of the rogues too damning to argue around. Dorian, when finally pressed directly, crumbled entirely. First denying everything, then, under the weight of evidence and the cold, expectant silence of dozens of alphas waiting for an answer, admitting in a halting, resentful voice that yes, he had been angry, and yes, he had wanted to teach her a lesson, and that he hadn't thought it would matter, because it never had before. It never had before. The casual horror of that admission settled over the chamber like a physical weight. And then there was one more. Edmund Crail was called to testify, and Otaline braced herself. For the same quiet cowardice she'd seen in him 3 weeks ago, the cool hand on her forehead, the salve that did nothing, but Edmund did not defend himself. Instead, he reached into his own coat and drew out a worn leather folio. "I falsified the report," he said, his voice low, "because I was given to understand clearly that my position, and possibly worse, depended on it. I am not asking this council to forgive that." His hands trembled, "but I am a healer, and there are things a healer cannot unsee. So every time I was made to write a lie, I also wrote the truth, and I kept it." He opened the folio, years of it, the real examinations, the real wounds, dates, names, Cormac, Betrayal. Others Otaline had never heard of, and, near the top fresh and unmistakable, her own. "I treated Otaline Marsh's wounds and called them a training accident," Edmund said. "I knew they were not. I have known for years what this family was. And I was too afraid to speak. So I did the only brave thing a coward can do." He set the folio on the table. I kept the record, and I waited. For someone with the power to use it, he looked then, directly at Otaline. "I'm sorry. I should have been your healer. I was your accomplice instead. This is the only apology I have." The chamber was very still, and Otaline realized with a strange ache that there had been two people all along, keeping records in the dark, powerless to speak, waiting for the day someone would finally look. Her mother. And the very man she had blamed most. The council's deliberation did not take long. When the senior Alpha rose to deliver judgment, the chamber fell silent once more. Dorian Falkry was stripped of all rank, all titles, all claim to future leadership of Moon Hollow. He would face formal exile, banished permanently, with no pack willing to take him in Alpha Garrick Falkra, for knowingly approving the attempted abduction of a wolf under another Alpha's protection, and for years of systematic cover-up, was removed from his position as Alpha, effective immediately. Leadership passing, under the council's oversight, to a transitional council. One required to demonstrate a clear commitment to the well-being of every member of the pack. Not merely those with the right family name. Edmund Crail was stripped of his position. Though the council, taking into account his cooperation and the coercion he had faced, did not pursue further punishment. A mercy Edmund accepted with the same quiet, exhausted relief he'd shown throughout. As the judgment was read, Otaline watched Garrick's face. Watched decades of easy confidence collapse into something small and old. And finally fully accountable, she felt no satisfaction in their downfall, not exactly. What she felt more than anything was a kind of release, because it wasn't just her own truth that had finally been heard. It was Cormac's and Brielle's, and the Ashgroves, and however many others over the years whose pain had been quietly buried. The same way hers nearly had been. Beside her, Lucan's hand tightened around hers, and when she looked up at him, she found him watching her. Not the council, not Garrick. Her, it's over, he said quietly. Just for her. All of it. You're safe, Otaline. Truly safe now. Not just because Dorian and Garrick are gone, but because the truth is out. Finally, in a place where it can never be buried again, tears pricked at her eyes. Not from grief this time, from something far gentler. Relief, hope, the strange, almost dizzying sensation of a weight she'd carried so long she'd forgotten what it felt like to be without it. Finally lifting away, "Thank you," she whispered, just to him, for seeing me. When nobody else would, always, Lucan said softly, and in front of the entire Grand Alpha Council. He leaned down and kissed her, gently, openly, without a trace of the careful political caution that had governed every part of his public life for 11 years. Moon Hollow changed slowly. In the months that followed, the way a forest changes after a long winter. Not all at once, but in small signs that accumulate. Until one day you look around and realize everything is different. Cormac was reinstated to active duty, with a formal acknowledgement of the injustice that had ended his career 2 years early. Brielle returned from the remote outpost and was offered, with genuine apology, a senior position in the pack's healing house. The Ashgrove family was invited back, their land restored, and slowly, carefully other wolves began to come forward too, with smaller injustices, smaller silences, and the transitional council listened. To each one, that more than anything, seemed to be the change that mattered most. Otaline's mother sought her out eventually. The conversation was difficult, full of the kind of careful, painful honesty that took them both a long time to get through. "I'm not asking you to forgive me," her mother said, her voice breaking. "I just needed you to know that I see it now, all of it. And I am so sorry. You weren't silent because you didn't care," Otaline said, reaching for her mother's hand. "You were silent because you were afraid, and you still kept the box. In the end, it's what saved me, and everyone else. We can figure out the rest. Together, if you want to." Her mother nodded, and took her hand, and for the first time in years. Otaline let her. She didn't stay in Moon Hollow, though, not permanently. There was too much healing still ahead for her there, and Vosburg territory had become, in a way she hadn't expected, something that felt increasingly like home. So she split her time, helping Moon Hollow heal, and spending the rest of her days in Vosburg, where Lucan's people had welcomed her with a warmth that still caught her off guard. And she and Lucan grew closer, not in dramatic moments, but in the slow accumulation of small things. Mornings in the library, evenings on the ridge where he'd first told her how he felt. There was a night, weeks after the hearing, when she found herself in his quarters. The fire burned low, and he'd pulled her close against his side. "For 3 weeks," she said slowly, "I thought the worst thing that happened to me was the attack, the pain, the infection. But I think, actually, the worst part was the silence afterward, being hurt. And then having everyone decide your pain isn't real. Somehow it makes you start to wonder if maybe you're the one who's wrong. She tilted her head back to look at him. You didn't just believe me, Lucan. You looked for me. Before I'd said a single word. And I think that's when I started falling in love with you. Lucan went very still, and then slowly he reached up and cupped her face in both hands, his silver eyes searching hers. Otaline, he said, his voice rough, I love you. I think I've loved you since that first evening in the records hall. When you finally sat down and let out that breath, like you'd been holding it for weeks. I just didn't have the right to say it. Not until you were safe, not until you could choose freely. I don't want to start over somewhere new, she said softly. I want this. I want you. I just didn't know if I was allowed. To want something this good. After everything, you're allowed, Lucan said, fierce with feeling. You're allowed to want everything good, Otaline. Starting now, wrapped together in the warmth of the dying fire, she pressed her ear to his chest and listened to his heartbeat. Slow and steady, and felt, for the first time in longer than she could remember, completely and entirely. At peace, I never want to go back, she murmured, half asleep, to standing alone, telling people it hurts. And watching them look away, his arms tightened around her, and he pressed a kiss to the top of her head. You'll never have to, he said quietly. Not again, not ever, for as long as I live. You will never have to face anything alone, and outside over the ridge where he'd first told her the truth, the last light of evening faded gently into stars.